Welcome back to Western Civilization 1. This is Dr. Young, your instructor. We are continuing our discussion today of the Republican period of Rome, and specifically getting into the late Republic. From about 150 or so BCE to 31 BCE, and that is a very specific date because something quite monumental happens at that point. In the last video, we talked about the wars of conquest that Rome embarked on in the 3rd and 2nd centuries, noting in particular the Punic Wars, fought against Carthage for mastery of the Western Mediterranean. Once Carthage was kind of taken out of the way, Rome was free to move wherever it wanted to in the Western Mediterranean, and began to set its sights on the Eastern Mediterranean, and kind of in piecemeal fashion, the Romans gradually chewed up more and more of the land of the Eastern Mediterranean. They did this in a variety of ways. They claimed to be, for instance, the protectors of the Greek tradition, and that gave them an excuse to oust the Macedonian rulers from Greece, who had been kind of dominating Greece since Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. The Greeks were not particularly thrilled about being ruled by the Romans any more than they were by the Macedonians, but they over time accepted their fate and became incorporated into the growing Roman Empire. So there was one of the points that we should make here at the outset is that in the Eastern Mediterranean there was a lot of land, there were a lot of different kingdoms. Really the Hellenistic kingdoms that survived the aftermath of the conquest of Alexander the Great had, for the most part, folded by this point, and there were small kingdoms ruling over different parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. The only one that still remained intact was the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, which we talked about a great deal in a previous class or previous lecture. And so we need to keep an eye on that, okay? But let's think about the problems of conquering so much land. You might not think there are problems. The Romans now had, tremendous resources at their disposal. But really the problem was that Rome had a political and social system that was designed for the governing of a small city-state, and yet it now held a vast empire with huge numbers of conquered peoples, some of whom had been incorporated into the Roman system now for a couple of centuries, and even thought of themselves as allies of Rome, others of whom had been recently conquered and still were kind of enslaved or subjected to Roman rule. And so I've listed here a few problems of conquest. The first one, as it says on the slide there, is allies and conquered people. Some peoples of Italy, the inhabitants of Etruria or Campania, for instance, had been dominated by the Romans since the 4th century, or maybe even earlier in a couple of cases. In other words, for 250 years or so, these people had been subjects of the Romans, and they had been paying tribute or taxes, and really thought of themselves as integrated into the Roman system. The problem was that they did not have all of the privileges of being Roman citizens. They were not considered full members of the society, and they wanted to be. They were left out of many opportunities as a result of that, and the Romans continued to dominate over them. And there were some politicians in Rome who began to argue the case for the allied peoples, particularly, again, for the peoples of Italy who were closely integrated into the Roman system. Roman politicians said we need to grant them full citizenship, they need to be our full partners in all of this. There were conservative elements who said, no, we've got to maintain Roman privilege. And so this became one of the key political issues of the late Republic. Another major issue is the creation of what are called latifundia. That's a Latin term that can be loosely translated as plantation, or actually latifundia is the plural there, latifundium would be the singular. But think
large-scale slave-run plantations. Why did these show up in Roman territory? Well, I think the answer is obvious. The Romans had conquered a vast amount of land and had lots and lots of conquered peoples at their disposal whom they could enslave. And the elite Romans, the patricians for the most part, who acted or held the lion's share of power in the Roman government, laid claim to these massive estates in the conquered regions, in Italy, down in North Africa, in Iberia, and other places, and worked the land with huge numbers of slaves who had been taken as war captives. Now, that might not seem like a terrible problem. Well, the problem was that only a few people in the Roman system benefited from this. Pretty much the elite patricians had latifundia, and nobody else did. And that created a wealth disparity that began to be troublesome. Now, it's problematic for the following reason. According to the Republican system in Rome, the system of the Republic, people served the Republic because it was their duty to do so. Now, we talked about this a little bit when we discussed the structures of the Roman government. People who were the men who were elected consuls and praetors and other elected to other Roman positions served without pay, and in fact they had to kind of provide their own funds if they wanted to get any projects done. If they wanted to, say, build a new temple or a new monument or something, even if they needed to raise an army, for the most part the officials paid for those things on their own. They didn't benefit from high taxation or anything like that because they didn't have that. Now, the problem is that poor people were also expected to serve the Republic without any thought of reward. It was their duty to do so. And so in fighting all of these wars over the course of a couple of centuries, and particularly, fighting these massive, large-scale wars like the Punic Wars, there were a lot of poor Romans who fought in the army, sometimes for a period of several years, without receiving any long-term remuneration for that. Now, while they were in the field, they were provided for by their commander out of the spoils of war or out of the commander's own funds, but as soon as the army was disbanded, these Roman military veterans went back to their homes, back to their farms, which were in many cases dilapidated because they hadn't been around to monitor what was going on there, and they ended up quite impoverished as a result of this, really as a result of serving and doing their duty to the Republic. And so this, and we're not just talking about a few people here. We're talking about large numbers of people who were conscripted to fight in the Roman army out of duty to the Republic. Now, this is doubly an issue because with the latifundia, the patricians who held those latifundia were able to produce food and other agricultural commodities at a much higher rate and at a much cheaper price because they were working the land with slaves. And they were producing in huge commodities on these massive plantations. And so even those military veterans who went back home and still had their farms intact found that their efforts were being undercut by the presence of these gigantic latifundia. This is similar in some ways to the state of agriculture in the mid to late 20th century in the United States. I grew up, for instance, in a farming community in rural Idaho. People growing mostly potatoes, but a few other crops there as well. My uncle was a farmer, for instance. And, when I was a kid, even, there were lots of kind of small family farms. But over time, the large farming corporations began to crowd out the small family farmers. And this began in the middle of the 20th century. By the end of the 20th century, there were only a few small family farmers left. And the gigantic farm corporations like Monsanto and Archer Daniels Midland and ConAgra ended up, owning the lion's share of the land and producing the most food and other agricultural products because they could produce in scale. There's a concept in economics called economies of scale, that when you scale up, it becomes cheaper to produce the next unit of production until it reaches a kind of saturation point. But in any case, producing on a higher scale means you can produce at a cheaper rate, right? Well, that's exactly what the latifundia were doing to the small family farmers of Rome. Now, Rome was a traditional agricultural society. That was very much bound up with the identity of the Romans, and this whole system began to undercut. The presence of latifundia began to undercut that whole kind of cultural identity. And so this led to a great deal of tension between those on the opposite sides of the wealth gap, and this wealth gap corresponded for the most part with the honor gap. Those who held the wealth, those who had latifundia, received the government positions and other things that they would need in order to gain honor, and the plebeians for the most part were pretty much shut out of this. There are some exceptions, of course, but this is the state that Rome was in. It's actually similar in some ways to the kinds of class-based tension that one might see in early 20th century, particularly after the First World War, Europe, or perhaps even somewhat of the class-based tension that we see in the United States today, where there's a lot of talk about the 1% and the 99% and things like that. And so we can perhaps recognize what's going on in Rome by thinking about those and using that as a kind of analogy for it. Now, we already talked about the Corvus here. Okay, now, this situation lent itself very well to the personal ambitions of a number of Roman politicians. For the most part, these were patricians. But some of these patricians saw that if they could tap into the discontent being expressed by these poor plebeians, and especially by the military veterans, and also if they could latch on to the issue of what to do with the non-citizen Italians who had been allied with the Romans for centuries, that they could get the support of a huge block of people in Rome and thus come to great political power. There were still others who resisted doing that, seeing that as kind of pandering to the masses, that the Roman politics ought to be above that. And so, we have a fight here in the late Republic between what we might call traditionalists and progressives, or there are actually some other terms for this that I'll bring to your attention. But one of the first to notice this situation and try to exploit it was a guy named Tiberius Gracchus. Tiberius was the son, or rather he was the scion, of one of the most prestigious patrician families in Rome. His grandfather, I believe, on his mother's side, was Scipio Africanus, the guy who defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama at the end of the Second Punic War. And that kind of feat would essentially set up a family for generations with the highest level of honor that one could achieve in Rome. And so it wasn't like Tiberius Gracchus was hurting for honor or for attention, but he had a great deal of personal ambition, and he didn't necessarily want to go kind of climb through the ranks slowly. He wanted power, and he wanted it now, and he saw his path running through these discontented populations who were ready for change. And so Tiberius Gracchus, because his father, I believe it was his father's side, I could be getting this wrong, but I think it was his father's side that had plebeian ancestry, he was eligible to become tribune. Now, you need to recall the structures of the Republic that we talked about in the last lecture. The tribune was the highest plebeian magistrate office, and it held imperium just like the consul did. Okay. So rather than wait and climb through the cursus honorum, like elite Romans had been doing for generations, he decided to maneuver himself into being elected tribune, and then to use the imperium, the executive power that the tribune held, kind of to advance his own political interests. Okay. And so we pick up a source here. This is Plutarch, whom I've mentioned before, I believe. He was a historian, a writer of the late 1st century CE. And so he's writing a couple hundred years after Tiberius Gracchus here, but he captures what Tiberius was about. Okay, so Plutarch writes, "At last, Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus," and, sorry for the yawn, pause, "an eminent man, ambitious for honor," note the word there, right, "a forceful orator, and for these causes well known to everybody, made an eloquent speech while tribune on the subject of the Italian race." Now, that's understood here. The Italian race is a reference to the non-Roman, non-citizen Italians who had been incorporated into the Roman system, right? He's talking about these people. He's raising their cause, deploring that a people so warlike and related in descent to the Romans were gradually seeking into pauperism and decreasing in numbers with no hope of betterment. And he basically says here that they ought to be granted citizenship, and we need to make sure that these people are taken care of. They're provided for by Rome, right? And then, if we skip down a few lines down here to this point, after this address, he once more brought forward the law, providing that no one should hold more than 500 jugera of the public land. Now, just to clarify what's going on here, there was a law that had been, made at some point in Roman history, stating that public land was land that was conquered by Rome, and technically it was owned by everybody, but private interests would go in and lay claim to certain amounts of the public land. The law dictated that this had to be limited to 500 jugera. I am not, off the top of my head, I cannot remember exactly how big a jugera is, like how it corresponds to acres. But this is still a significant plot of land, I think, but no more than 500 jugera. Well, some of the latifundia, these slave-run plantations, were vastly larger than that, right? And so Tiberius Gracchus is challenging the ability of the patricians to hold, to lay claim to these latifundia, okay? And he goes even further. He made this addition to the previous law that the sons of the present occupants might each hold half as large an allotment, and that the surplus land should be divided up among the poor by triumvirs, who were to be changed yearly. Now, what that means is that he is saying, okay, with imperium, with the power that is vested in me as a tribune, I am now decreeing that the next generation of property holders will have their lands that they have claimed from the public land, that is the conquered land, cut in half. And that we'll take all of that excess land, the half of everything that these latifundia owners had, and we'll distribute it among the poor. And he's thinking here in particular of military veterans, and that there would be a commission appointed of 3 men, the triumvirs as it says, who would make these determinations and would do the dividing up. Well, he maneuvered it so that he and his brother and his father were the 3 men making these choices. In other words, Tiberius Gracchus was kind of creating a law about land redistribution. This was his political platform. Well, as you might imagine, the poor people, the people who had been disenfranchised by the whole system, the military veterans and others, were thrilled with this prospect that they would be given, land out of this that had been claimed by these patricians. The patricians, on the other hand, who again hold the lion's share of the power, were not happy with this at all, as you might imagine. And in fact, shortly after this, Tiberius Gracchus was assassinated. The project, or rather the process of land reform, was not stopped by his assassination, however. Later on, a few years later, his brother Gaius became the tribune as well, and continued to argue for land reform and continued to pursue this project, and also for the granting of citizenship to the Italian allies, and so this didn't go away, right? And so what we end up with really are 2 camps of politicians, mostly patricians, At least the patricians, or all of the dominant figures in these two camps, are patricians, but some of them were seeking to advance plebeian interests because they saw that as the way to come to greater political popularity and greater political power and greater honor, moreover, right? We cannot call these parties. There's no kind of party apparatus to these things. These are political schools of thought or political camps. The two camps are the populares and the optimates. The populares were those who, well, a couple of features. The ones who were likely to take up the cause of the plebeians, to argue for things like land reform and extension of citizenship to more Italian peoples and other things like that. The populares also tended to argue that laws should be passed, that business should be done through the plebeian council and through the office of tribune rather than through the cursus honorum and through the Senate. On the other hand, the optimates were the conservatives. These are the patricians who said essentially that all things would be great and perfect with the republic if the privileges of patricians were just seen to, if they were protected, because, as they argued, the patricians were the ones who did all the work for everybody else. They were the ones who held the high positions in government, who led the militaries, who created jobs and other things. This is not unlike the argument for the so-called trickle-down economics that some politicians have used in the last few decades in the United States. Ronald Reagan, in particular, was a great champion of what he called trickle-down economics, and we can go back even further to economic thinkers and philosophers like Frederick Hayek and Ayn Rand. But the argument there is, if you make sure that rich people have what they need and they're not interfered with, they're not regulated, they're not really taxed very highly, then they will take all of their resources and do great things with them, and that will benefit all of society. They will create the jobs and produce the innovations and all the other things that really make society work well. So that's trickle-down economics, and the optimates really argued very much along those lines. The populares said, no, we've got to change the way Rome runs. We need to, again, extend more privileges to people who don't have them at this point and take them away from the patricians. Now you might think, okay, these are patricians. Why would they be arguing this on behalf of the plebeians? Well, there was a lot of honor and a lot of political popularity, political clout that could be gained by taking up the cause of the plebeians. And as we're going to see, there are figures among the populares who come to tremendous power as a result of this. What's really going on, I think, in both camps is a tremendous amount of personal ambition. In fact, if we have to look at one factor in the late Republic that really animates everything, it's the personal ambitions of these key figures. Now, I'm going to take us on a tour here of some of the key figures of the late Republic. Now that we've laid out the context, talked about the issues that were animating society and politics in Rome, I want to talk about a few key figures and try to fit them into these camps and talk about how these things take shape. So the first of these is Marius. Now, Marius is the guy pictured to the left here. This is a bust of Marius. Toward the end of the 2nd century BCE, so Tiberius Gracchus was tribune, I think, in the year 133 BCE, and then his brother Gaius about a decade later in 123 BCE. And so, that's just to orient us chronologically. Marius is about 20 to 30 years later. He came to the fore of Roman politics. One of the things to note about Marius is that he was a novus homo. This is a very important term in this Roman era. It means new man. Okay, novus means new, homo means man. A novus homo is someone who is only recently elevated to the ranks of the patricians. All right. And normally, novi homines, so that's the plural of that, would be sort of, well, they would be thought by their fellow patricians to be lesser human beings. Normally, a novus homo would not be able to reach the highest levels of government or do anything truly extraordinary. Receiving the grant of patrician status was considered by most patricians to be reward enough, whereas people who had who came from families who had been in the patrician ranks for generations or maybe even centuries were considered to have a great deal more honor. Now, being a novus homo seems to have motivated Marius to do extraordinary things. Marius was, it seems, a brilliant military strategist, and he put that to work in a war that Rome was fighting in North Africa against the Numidian people. These are the same people who had allied with Rome a century earlier in the fight against Hannibal. They were now the target of Roman aggression, and Rome fought this war against the Numidians. Marius ended up through a kind of convoluted process that I'm not going to go into, as the commander of the military in the Numidian War, and he managed, through kind of brilliant tactical choices, to win a stunning victory in that war, and thus came to great honor as a result of this. All right. Now, Marius at this point probably could have gone back to Rome and taken up a position in the Senate and maybe even been elected consul and everything, and kind of could have pursued a life that would have been extraordinary by the standards that were normally, or the restrictions normally placed placed upon a novus homo. But Marius decided that he was going to try to press for even greater recognition, greater honor, greater power. To do this, and this is a key innovation, and one that is going to have tremendous consequences over pretty much the rest of the period of the Republic, he created the Roman Republic's first professional army. Really, in practice, the way the Romans would have understood this is that he took on all of his soldiers fighting under him as clients, and he was the patron of all of them. Now, most of these men are plebeians. Basically, he said, look, I will be your patron. I will do what a patron is supposed to do. That is, I will fight your cause for you. I will make sure that your voice is heard in Roman political affairs. I will advance your interests in every way. And being military veterans, the thing that these guys wanted most was some sort of remuneration for a recognition for what they had done in fighting this war, rather than just be disbanded from the army and go back to dilapidated farms like farmers in earlier generations had done. Okay. Now, because these men became his clients, of course, their primary loyalty was directed at Marius rather than at the Republic. All right. And so with this army, and he didn't disband his army. Normally, after winning a war, a Roman commander would go back to the city of Rome, take his army with him, and he would disband his army there, or he might leave it in the field and disband it. And he would, enter Rome and be received with all sorts of glory and pomp. There was a kind of ritual called a triumph that the Romans would hold for a victorious commander. They would allow him to ride through the streets with conquered peoples in chains before him, and he would receive the praise of the whole city. It's kind of like having a ticker tape parade, and this was considered to be the highest honor that one could receive in Rome. Well, Marius probably had a triumph, but he left his army intact. And essentially, when he returned to the Senate, he made some veiled threats, or there may have been some passive-aggressive rhetoric here. The basic message Marius was sending was, I have an army at my disposal. They are loyal to me and not necessarily to the Republic. That's a really nice political system you have there, I would hate to see anything bad happen to it. And I want power, right? That's his message. So Marius was elected consul, okay? At the end of his first year, or rather his year as consulship, and remember, consul is supposed to be, like other magistrate positions, supposed to be limited to 1-year terms. Marius said, I'd like to be consul again. And, the senators basically said, well, Marius, you're not supposed to. That's against the law. That's against tradition. And, here he's saying, well, I've got this army. I'm not afraid to use it. And so they named him consul again. And at the end of the second year, he said, I'd like to be consul again. And ultimately, Marius ended up being consul for 5 straight years. Now, ultimately, with a great deal of flattery, the senators convinced him to step down, and he remained very integral to Roman political affairs. He later on became consul another couple of times, but he was distracted from what he probably could have done with this amount of power and with an army at his disposal. The thing that Marius did, and the reason he's really, really important here, is that he showed an example for other ambitious men, essentially sending the message that if you want real power in Rome, not just traditional power, but outsized power in Rome, power that bucks tradition, you have to have a client army. Okay. Now, the figure who took this message most to heart was Sola. This is a bust of Sola here. Obviously, the nose has been damaged. Sola was not missing a nose, it seems, but this is the most famous bust of Sola, and unfortunately, the nose has been broken off or worn off over the years. I pause for the yawn. Okay. Sola was an underling of Marius. He was a kind of, commander in the army of Marius. He doesn't seem to have gotten along very well with Marius. Sola felt slighted by Marius. In his mind, he didn't receive the recognition he should have for making some of the battlefield choices that he made. Marius sort of, took all the credit for everything, and Sola said, well, I was the one who did a lot of that stuff, and so he already had this a great deal of personal animosity directed toward Marius. The other thing about Sola that we should note is that he was very much a conservative, a traditionalist. If Marius, for the most part, would fit under the camp of the populares, in that he was advancing the interests of plebeians, that is his soldiers, Sola wanted to ensure that the patricians would remain the most important priority for the Republic, right? So what he did was pretty much diametrically opposed to everything that Marius represented. Okay. But he saw what Marius had done and realized that that's what he needed to do. All right. So once Marius had stepped down from being consul, Sola managed to be elected consul. He stood for consulship 1 year and became elected consul. And by this point, the really important thing, or the greatest benefit from being consul, was not the year as consul. It was rather that a retiring consul would usually be given a governorship over some frontier region, and going along with that, they would often receive troops whom they could command. That was what Sola wanted. All right. So he was elected consul, and actually before he finished his year as consul, he raised an army and said, I need to go off to Asia Minor and fight this war. The Romans had been sort of on again, off again in conflict with a king called Mithridates in the kingdom of Pontus. And he said, I need to go fight against Mithridates, and so I need to take this army and do that. And as consul, that was within his purview. And really his intention was to turn this Roman army into his own personal client army and to use that to advance his political interests. Marius, who was still alive by this point, recognizing what Sola was doing, once Sola had left for the east, kind of prosecuted him, made some speeches, cast aspersion on Sola's character, and the Senate ultimately revoked Sola's consulship. But Sola now had an army at his disposal. In the meantime, Marius dies, and a guy named Cinna takes over leadership of Marius's faction. Well, Sola went off to Asia Minor, fought briefly, but when he heard what Marius and his allies were doing to besmirch his character and remove his power, he marched his army back to Rome, and the long and short of it is this ended up in a civil war. The faction of Marius is dead, so he wasn't involved directly in this, but the faction of Marius fought against Sola and his army, and Sola was victorious. All right, I've just elided over a whole lot of details, but that's okay. Now, Sola took over the city, all right, and proclaimed to the Senate and to all of the assemblies that this was a dire hour, that Rome was riven by civil war, and that the only solution for this was to name him dictator. And really, I mean, he held the power. There was nobody who was going to try to oppose him, so Sulla became dictator. Now remember, the dictatorship is only supposed to last for 6 months. Well, at the end of the 6 months, Sulla said, look, we still have a crisis on our hands. I need to be dictator again. And for several straight 6-month terms, in fact, ultimately for about 4 or 5 years, Sulla was dictator. During that time, he tried to roll back all of the reforms that had been made by politicians in the camp of the Populares all the way back to Tiberius Gracchus. Laws about land reform and limitations on patrician land, limitations in other ways on patricians, the kind of expansion of the power of the tribune and the plebeian council. He pushed back against all of that, made decrees that stripped away some of those powers. He made an effort to restore the Roman Republic to what it had been previous to the rise of the Populares. And while he was alive, he succeeded in doing this. Now, like most other Romans, he eventually left office and retired, and died shortly thereafter. And really, once Sulla died, or once he was removed from power, there was no one in the camp of the Optimates who had his kind of gravitas, his kind of charisma. And there were even some, many in fact, who thought that Sulla had overreached, and they weren't willing to take up the cause, and so his retirement and death resulted in a kind of power vacuum. Now let's consider what we have here at this point in the Republic. We have patterns having been set by Marius and Sulla and Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus that show that if you have a client army, if you have people who are loyal to you, if you have a great deal of personal ambition, if you're willing to buck the traditional system and do something different, you can achieve power unlike that that had been achieved by Romans, going back for centuries. Effectively, you can become like a monarch. Of course, no Roman would ever admit or state that he wanted to become a king, but that really was kind of what was going on. They were all fighting over the greatest amount of honor, the greatest amount of power, and at this point there's a political vacuum. That vacuum was filled ultimately by 3 men. And we could throw a 4th one in there, and that would be Cicero, but we need to treat him separately. Of course, one of your assigned readings for this week, and the one you need to write a paper on, are the speeches of Cicero. Okay, these 4 speeches, the speeches against Lucius Sergius Catilina, and so I'm going to treat those a bit separately from this, but let's talk about the first triumvirate. All right, so we have pictured here at the upper right of the slide 3 men. This is Julius Caesar, this is Crassus, this is Pompey. All right. Just to give you some background on these 3. Crassus and Pompey had been allies of Sulla. One of the things that Sulla did when he became dictator was eliminated a lot of his rivals. He pronounced what were called proscriptions, which are basically the arrest and seizure of all of the property of his political rivals. He could do this with his powers as dictator. There were many patricians, many senators, in fact, who were arrested and executed, and all of their assets were seized. It was pretty much a bloodbath while Sulla was in charge. And those who were allied with Sulla often benefited greatly from this. They received the, and so, part of the prescriptions was the seizure of land of all of these patricians, and then Sulla doled this out to his supporters. As a result, both Crassus and Pompey became fabulously wealthy from receiving all of these grants from Sulla, and they continued to make shrewd economic moves to the point that they became the richest men in Rome. And Crassus in particular was probably by far the wealthiest. Julius Caesar, on the other hand, as part of the camp of the Populares from the time he was a young man, was one of the targets of Sulla. He was one of the rivals, and in fact, during the dictatorship of Sulla, Caesar had to flee Rome and go off into exile. Otherwise, he would have been arrested and executed, and his assets would have been seized. And when Caesar came back, in fact, he was quite impoverished. His prospects were not good. It was really through a series of key alliances he made with other Romans and some shrewd political maneuvers that he was able to come to a good deal of power. All right. Now, these three men, although they came from somewhat different backgrounds, they were all patricians, but some of them had been allied with Sulla, and some of them Caesar had been an enemy of Sulla's, ended up forming a secret partnership. Now, I'm going to gloss over the details of that. Essentially, Pompey had been consul early, just after Sulla's death, and had taken an army and conquered a bunch of land in the eastern Mediterranean, had really sort of finished the war that Sulla had begun with Mithridates. And when he returned, he wanted privileges extended to his military veterans. There were traditionalists in the Senate who didn't like what Pompey was arguing and wanted to strip him of power and other things like that. Crassus and Caesar had formed a partnership, agreeing to help each other out, and this backlash that Pompey received after making these tremendous conquests ended up driving him into the arms of Caesar and Crassus. Okay, so these three men formed a secret partnership. It's called historically the First Triumvirate. Okay, the triumvirate just means organization of three men. All right, and the agreement stipulated that these three would help each other out, that they would help each other rise to the highest political positions that they could. They would each argue for the case of the others in a case of a consular election or something like that. And really, this partnership was intended to make sure that they were not limited in the amount of power that they would receive. Now, the three men did recognize probably that that the biggest threat to any one of them was the other two. But this partnership existed and benefited all three, at least for a time. We're going to see there is conflict ultimately between them. Now, I'm going to elide over some of this, okay, over some of the history here. And simply state that, let's go to this map, all right. Crassus was elected consul and took an army over here to fight against the Parthian Empire. This was the empire that had ousted the Seleucids from Persia and Mesopotamia and, sort of existed on the eastern frontier of Rome as a major threat. He fought a war against the Parthians, and Crassus was killed in that war. And so that left the situation where Caesar and Pompey were, and Crassus had been kind of the glue that held this partnership together. He was a close friend of both Caesar and Pompey. Caesar and Pompey were not closely allied with each other. It was sort of, they both agreed to work together through Crassus. Once Crassus was eliminated, their rivalry kind of, came to the fore. All right. Caesar was elected consul, and then as his reward for being consul, he was given the proconsulship of Gaul. Now, at the time, that means that he was appointed governor over Gaul. Now, at the time, Gaul consisted of northern Italy, kind of up here by the Alps, and across the Alps over here into what was known as Transalpine Gaul, which was what is now southern France. Okay, and with that proconsular authority, Caesar put together a client army and went conquering up into Gaul. And all of this territory you see in yellow here, pretty much all of what is now France and Belgium, even up into the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and to some extent over here into what is now Switzerland, Caesar conquered all of that territory. This took him about 10 years. He was the proconsul for Gaul that whole time. And while he was doing this, Caesar wrote accounts of his exploits. And these accounts ended up being, he was a great Latin stylist. In fact, students who make it to the intermediate stage of Latin classes often have Caesar presented them as their text for reading. He's quite accessible, but he's also a good Latin stylist. These texts ended up being like bestsellers in Rome at the time. And Caesar, as a result of that, gained tremendous popularity from these accounts of his military exploits. Pompey had conquered all of this territory over here that is in blue. Okay, so this part of North Africa. Pontus is up here, you can see, and then down here into what is known as Cilicia and Syria, and even subjected Judea, which was ruled at this point by, by a dynasty called the Hasmonean dynasty. Later on, he would be ruled by a guy named Herod. But Judea ended up becoming a kind of tributary state to Rome. So Pompey was responsible for conquering all of this land, right? Now, both of these men, tremendous commanders of military troops, were, standing at the head of these massive client armies, and really the ultimate clash, as we're going to see, came between the two of them, right? Now, I want to pause in that at this point and talk about Cicero. He's not pictured here, but Cicero was really he's another tremendously important figure during this time. But if Caesar and Crassus and Pompey were the ones who were trying to achieve power that really, didn't hold with the traditional channels of power in Rome, Cicero was the chief representative of the traditionalists in this period. He was, Caesar was definitely one of the populares. Pompey sort of sat in the middle of the optimates and the populares. Cicero, on the other hand, was very much a traditionalist, very much one of the optimates. All right, which is curious because Cicero was a novus homo, and you might think that a novus homo would be in touch with his plebeian roots and would argue the case for his fellow kind of former plebeians, but Cicero was also a philosopher of some renown, a great orator, a great kind of theoretician of the political values of Rome, or a great writer of these things in any case. And so, he had this very traditional view of Rome that informed everything that he did. And to some extent, this all relied on the philosophical school of Stoicism. This is not something I've gone into detail on here. Stoicism was a political school of thought that arose during the Hellenistic period, but found special resonance in Rome because it emphasized finding meaning through doing one's duty. And specifically, as the Romans interpreted it, through doing one's duty to the Republic, to the Roman state. So Cicero was, the greatest of all of the exponents of Stoicism in the Roman tradition, and believed very firmly in this approach to things, and that informed his, kind of his traditionalism and his conservatism. Now, interestingly, on the basis of his tremendous oratorical ability, Cicero was the greatest speaker of Latin of his day, or one of the greatest in any case. He had made a lucrative career as a lawyer, because he was so good at speech making, on that basis, he, although he was a novus homo, managed to be elected consul when he was 42 years old, which, according to the law of the time, was the youngest that one could be consul. So Cicero had risen up through the ranks very quickly. While Cicero was consul, there was a conspiracy to overthrow the Republic headed by a guy named Lucius Sergius Catilina, or we can simply say here Catiline. All right. Catiline, interestingly, was a blue-blooded patrician. He was from a very old, prestigious patrician family. One of the elites. He had a great deal of honor as a result of that, yet he was thwarted in some of his efforts to rise to high political position. When he was still quite a young man, he was elected, I think he was in his 30s or something like that. He was elected as praetor, which is one of the lower positions in the cursus honorum. And then after his time as praetor, he was given the governorship over North Africa. And while he was in North Africa, he was accused by many of corruption and tax fraud and some other things that cast aspersion on his character. Well, after that, he returned, and nobody ever kind of proved anything, but there were these rumors going around about what Catiline had done. Catiline returned to Rome and decided to stand for election as consul. And on the basis of these rumors, he was defeated, and there was a new rumor started that he had been making plans to assassinate the men who were elected consul and had defeated him in the election. Well, that was never proven either, but that cast further aspersion on his character. In any case, Catiline decided 2 years after that, in the year 64, to run for consul again. And he did this on the basis, or on the platform, of the forgiveness of debts. Now, one of the interesting things, curious things about Catiline is, although he was a patrician and came from a very old, prestigious, and wealthy patrician family, he was kind of a spendthrift. And he had blown through most of his inheritance and was deeply in debt to many people, and this was not necessarily a unique position for a patrician to be in, but if it was known that he was impoverished, he could potentially be removed from the ranks of the patricians. He would lose a great deal of honor, and so it's not surprising that he was campaigning on this platform of debt forgiveness. And so he was trying to appeal to the populates. He was setting himself up very much as a populatus politician. He was opposed in this election by Cicero. And Cicero was a great orator, picked up on these stories about his corruption, about his, this plot to assassinate the former consuls, and cast a great deal of aspersion on the character of Catiline, and ultimately defeated Catiline in that election. Now, Cicero also claimed that during the election and after, that Catiline arranged for him to be assassinated, and that all kind of added to the thickening of the plot here, right? So Cicero was consul. He was elected in 64, so he became consul in 63, and Catiline once again decided to stand for election as consul. Cicero argued against electing him, and it was obvious he was going to be defeated. And so Catiline at this point decided, it seems anyway, that he was no longer going to try to go through the official channels, that he was instead going to form his own client army and use it to overthrow the Republic and install himself as the dictator, much as Sola had done before him. And in fact, early in his life, Catiline had been a supporter of Sola and had benefited from the Sola prescriptions. Okay, so he decided to go through the path of Sola. Cicero, as consul, had spies and other resources at his disposal, and he managed to find out about these plans, and this is like I mean, your best kind of CIA, KGB sort of espionage stuff, Roman style. But he found out about Catiline's plans, and he took the evidence to the Senate. Now, why would Cicero go to the Senate? Well, he was one of the optimates. He felt that, the best channel to work through was the channel of traditional patrician power. In other words, he had to go through the Senate. The first speech, now you're assigned to read 4 speeches, okay? The first speech, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details here from the text itself. I want you to read it and interpret it and kind of see what's going on. Now that I've laid out all of that context, the first speech was given to the Senate. Cicero's goal in this speech was to have the senators rise up and call for the arrest of Catiline. Interestingly, just to lend, to the theater of that text, Catiline was in the Senate while Cicero was delivering this oration. He was still there. He had an army waiting for him outside the city with which he was going to attack the city, but he was still in the Senate. And so there are several times over the course of that speech when Cicero is talking directly to Catiline. And according to other accounts we have of this, there's another Roman author named Sallust who wrote his own account about the Catiline conspiracy. All of the senators got up and moved away from Catiline to the point that Catiline was sitting on one side of the room and all of the other senators were on the other side of the room. There are some famous paintings of this that have been done well after the fact, but in any case, that adds to the theater. One of the things that you have to note about that first speech is that Cicero is desperate to get the support of the Senate to prosecute Catiline. As the consul, he technically could have done this, but he decided he did not want to do this without senatorial support because he is still a novus homo. He doesn't have the honor necessary to act in such a way, particularly against an honorable, old-time, old-school senator like somebody from a prestigious family like Catiline, right? And so he tries several tactics in that speech to get the senators to rise up and call for his arrest, and he pauses at times, and the senators do absolutely nothing. Because he's a novus homo, they don't trust him, and so, he never gets what he wants. He builds up to a crescendo, and then you have to envision him pausing, and nothing happens, and so he has to redirect and come to others, approach the topic through some other means, and ultimately Cicero does not get his way. And so after this, though, Catiline fled Rome, and it was obvious that he was up to no good, and Rome kind of had to act, and so Cicero decided to go and give a speech to the plebeian council. And so the second speech, where it says to the people, really he's before the plebeian council. And in this case, he doesn't have to be so careful, right? He is a patrician. He's talking to plebeians for the most part. He can say whatever he wants and not have a backlash against him. And so in that speech, Cicero pulls no punches. I mean, he goes to the extreme in smearing Catiline's character. At one point he says something like, there is every murder, every theft, every crime that has ever been committed in Italy is the fault of Catiline. He is the one who's been behind them all. Just goes to the extreme in smearing his character. And so you have to read that, as Cicero trying to get a rise out of the plebeian council, people who are not as well informed and more volatile in their actions than the Senate is, right? Cicero has to speak to them. I mean, this would be the same as, we could compare him to a modern politician, take Barack Obama or Donald Trump, whichever one appeals to you most. One of those political figures speaking before an audience of supporters on the campaign trail is going to speak very differently than they would addressing, say, a joint session of Congress, right? And that's the difference between Cicero's speeches to the Senate and his speeches to the plebeian council. Now, in the third speech, Cicero has foiled the plot of Catiline. Pretty much Catiline is on the run, and Cicero now wants honor. I mean, he wants honor all through this, okay? But he wants honor for what he has done, and so really this is his effort to reveal to the Roman people what he has done in their behalf, right? And Cicero really, again, his goal is honor, and that's how you have to read that speech. The fourth speech is again to the Senate, and in this case, the Senate is trying to decide what to do with the people who were involved in the conspiracy with Catiline, and in that case, Cicero has to, again, be very careful. He's talking to the Senate, and what Cicero wants in that speech is for them to order the execution of the conspirators. And he tries to say, oh, I don't really care what we pronounce, but in order for this to come out the way he wants, and in order for it to be the kind of situation that he had always been trying to make it out as. So one of the things Cicero does in all of these speeches is says, this is the greatest crisis that Rome has ever faced. Why would he say that? Well, if he is the one who leads Rome through the greatest crisis that it has ever faced, then he is the greatest of all the Romans, and he should have the highest level of honor, right? If this is really just a kind of haphazard attempt at rebellion and really came to nothing, well, that's not any big deal. And so if the senators are going to say, well, this was not really a big problem and let's just let these people off, then Cicero doesn't end up with as much honor. Okay, so hopefully all of that information has helped you to kind of frame those speeches, and now you can read them effectively and respond to the prompt which asks you to interpret the motivations of both Cicero and Catiline. One of the things you should note about Catiline is, he was thwarted at every turn. Even though he's a patrician, even though he has honor, there were things that kept him from getting power. And so you have, two men working at cross purposes, Cicero hungry for honor, Catiline hungry for power, each of them willing to do kind of extreme things to get that, right? Okay, so that's a brief excursion into Cicero. Cicero was offered a position in the first triumvirate. There were, I don't remember whether it was Crassus or Caesar or Pompey, but one of them approached him and essentially offered to allow him to enter into a kind of partnership with them, and Cicero turned it down. He was too traditional and too conservative to kind of buck the system like that. And so, this Catiline conspiracy is happening as these three men were forming their partnership. All right. So, after that brief excursion, let's talk about, let's pick up the story again with Caesar and Pompey. All right. Now, let's recall, Caesar's up here in Gaul, Pompey's over here in Asia Minor, right? Each of them has a huge client army that they stand at the head of, all right? Pompey, as the more traditional and the more conservative of the two, decided to go back to Rome and effectively disband his army, or at least leave it over here in Greece and in Asia Minor, and to return to Rome and take up his position in the Senate, and to try to create an alliance with other senators, because he thought that if he did that first, that he could get Caesar to back down. And so Pompey returns to Rome and, forms this partnership with other senators. The Senate then decrees to Caesar that his proconsulship is up, that he is no longer the governor of Gaul, and that he needs to disband his army and return to Rome. If Caesar had done that, he would have been bested by Pompey, because Pompey would have done this first. He would have been in prime position in the Senate, and his interests would have been primary. Caesar recognized this and decided to make an act of treason. Instead of disbanding his army, he marched it into Italy and decided to attack Pompey. Now, that technically is an act of treason. He should have been stripped of his citizenship. And it seems that Pompey and others did not expect Caesar to do this. This caught them off guard. But Caesar did it. He marched his army down to Rome. Pompey was frantic. He and his supporters left Rome, went off to Greece to try to put Pompey's army back together so it could oppose the march of Caesar. When they did so, they somehow left behind most of the treasury in Rome, which fell into Caesar's hands once he occupied the city. Then Caesar marched his army out across Italy, boarded boats, and tracked down Pompey in Greece. In the year, let me think about this, when was it? In the year 47, 46 BCE or something like that, they came to an all-out war, a battle, and Caesar's army was victorious over Pompey. This is curious because Pompey's army, it seems, outnumbered Caesar's by something like 2 or 3 to 1, but Caesar proved to be the more brilliant military strategist and tactician, and his army bested that of Pompey. Pompey fled from the battlefield, got on a ship, went across the sea over here to Alexandria, thinking that he could whip up support for his cause down here in the Ptolemaic Empire in Alexandria, or in Egypt. But the ruler of Alexandria, whose name was Ptolemy, saw, and Ptolemy himself was involved in a dispute over the throne. He was not the rightful ruler of the Ptolemaic Empire. His niece, Cleopatra, was. But because she was a woman and because he, was quite ambitious, he had removed her from power, placed her under house arrest, and had taken over rulership in Alexandria. He figured that if he killed Pompey, that he would win Caesar over as an ally. And so as soon as Pompey landed, some of Ptolemy's men intercepted Pompey and killed him. And as soon as Caesar arrived with some of his advanced troops in Alexandria, Ptolemy sent him the present of Pompey's head. Instead of being thrilled with this, like Ptolemy had assumed he would be, Caesar became incensed, and he sort of declared war on Ptolemy. He ended up allying himself with Cleopatra, with whom he had a torrid affair, fathered a child with her. He removed Ptolemy from power, put Cleopatra back on the throne, and then proceeded from there to kind of mop up operations, and he returned to Rome and proclaimed himself dictator. And in this case, he was not going to equivocate. He said, look, I'm just going to be dictator for the rest of my life, right? I will be the ruler of Rome as long as I'm alive, okay? And he even began to talk about forming a hereditary system where his heir would take his place as the ruler of Rome. In other words, he's trying to set up a kind of monarchy. Caesar underestimated the Roman abhorrence of monarchy in this case. All right. Because only a couple of years after this, he was assassinated by a group of senators, some of whom had been allies of Pompey, by the way, including Marcus Decius Brutus and Cassius, Longius Cassius, the kind of the ringleaders of the conspiracy against Julius Caesar. They thought that removing Caesar from power, that killing him would essentially turn back the clock on all of these changes that Rome had been forced to undergo as a result of the personal ambitions of all of these men. They thought they could set up a coherent republic again. My, were they ever wrong. Because the supporters of Caesar, most of them plebeians, were simply not going to take his assassination quietly. And some of Caesar's key supporters, some of his, kind of underlings, particularly the guy named Marcus Antonius, who is pictured here, saw an opportunity to exploit this political discontent that existed in Rome after Caesar's assassination. And so Marcus Antonius allied himself with Caesar's nephew and his heir, Octavian, who was at the time only 18 years old. He also allied with another of Caesar's kind of key underlings, a guy named Lepidus, pictured here. And, you know, as things were in political disarray, they gained the support of the people, and they forced the conspirators out of Rome, tracked them down in Greece, defeated their armies, and killed them, and returned to Rome, and thus the second triumvirate was created. Now, this was not a secret agreement like the first one had been. This was an official organ of the Roman government. Effectively, the government was turned over to these three men, even though the Senate still was in operation, and the plebeian council and some other things. These three men were given rulership over all of the territory outside of Rome itself. Effectively, they became the only governors of Rome's far-flung empire. Okay. Now, we have a map here, all right. This was obviously taken from a book. You can see the page crease. But Octavian was given Gaul and Hispania. These are the territories, of course, that Caesar had ruled and conquered over, and so as the heir of Caesar, he was given that territory. Antony, who was the most powerful of the three, chose to rule over the East. Why would he do that? Well, this gave him the greatest opportunity to continue to conquer and expand Rome, which of course would have given him even more power and more honor. And so, you know, when he got first pick, he chose to take governorship over the East. Lepidus was given governorship over North Africa, which may sound like he got a raw deal, but in fact this isn't bad because North Africa was a tremendously productive region, and Lepidus, it was especially for agriculture, and Lepidus could use that to increase his own personal fortune. Now, we're setting up here a system that will ultimately come to blows between the members of the Second Triumvirate. But this lecture has gone on somewhat too long, I think, and so I'm going to stop it there and pick it up with, with the Second Triumvirate now ruling over their individual territories. Thanks.